first ever episode of the International Association of Political Science Students Oceania Region podcast. I am Mitchell McIntosh, the current chair of the region, and joining me today is Jamie Spiteri. Now, Jamie, before we get into it, would you want to tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to work with IAPSS Oceania?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I currently am the one of the liaison coordinators for the IAPSS Oceania region. Essentially, my role entails trying to grow membership from the grassroots level up and try and identify and work with like-minded organisations in the Oceania region. So I'm currently a student in my last year of a Bachelor of International Relations at La Trobe University. I'm also currently interning in the office of Senator David Van. I've written various pieces for organisations such as the ASEAN Australia Strategic Youth Partnership, specifically on my view that Australia as a republic will be better able to engage in the ASEAN regions. I've previously worked with different political parties and conservation groups, specifically around election times, which enmeshes my passions with of political science in also worthwhile causes, specifically for conservation groups. That is just a bit of a background of things that I bring to IAPSS Oceania.
Great stuff. Now, I do know that you have a particular interest in the Pacific Islands, which is quite relevant given that our topic for discussion is educational shortfalls in Australia and security developments surrounding the South Pacific. So what was it that started your interest in the Pacific Islands?
Right, well, quite simply, as I go through was studying international relations from an Australian point of view, I genuinely think that it's an area of great importance, specifically in terms of geopolitics and securitization, especially. So as I advanced through my degree, I found that there was a lot of options for students in Australia, specifically at La Trobe, to study Asia, right? We have many courses where we can study Asian languages, comparative politics in Southeast Asia, for example, genocides that occurred in Asia, the Chinese economy, anthropology on the Indian-Myanmar border, for example, all kinds of fascinating things about Asia. Yet there was absolutely next to nothing of the same sort for the Pacific Islands. So I studied a subject last year called Australian foreign policy, and we spent 1 week looking at the foreign policy implications of the Pacific. That was it. So apart from that, we briefed over Pacific Island workers in sugarcane fields in Queensland, which was during the White Australia policy and also carries pertinence into today. But the focus overall was far more on the White Australia policy than it was on the Pacific. So I guess the real thing that started my interest in the Pacific area was the actual lack of education. Right? So I actually tried to do something about it and emailed the director of international relations at La Trobe. I asked her basically what the advocacy would look like to start a subject on the politics of the Pacific Islands. I was essentially shut down with we don't have the teaching capacity for that subject kind of answer. I actually completely disagree with that. I've looked at some of the teacher profiles from La Trobe, and I know that we have lecturers that are very, very well versed in the Pacific. So I won't name names, but I know that there's one specific teacher who actually maintains consultancies in Fiji and has worked for Australia Aid and has worked for the Australian government in a capacity relating with Fiji. There's also a anthropologist who specialises in Samoan cultures. And I know a PhD candidate who's a good friend of mine who's currently studying refugees on Nauru and Manus Island. So I know that La Trobe especially has the capacity to teach this subject, and yet it's still just not viewed as something worthwhile.
So it seems as though your interest in it actually arises quite significantly from the fact that it simply isn't available for study. Would you say that's correct?
Well, yeah, that's essentially that's absolutely correct, 100%. So I know that ANU, Australian National University, to the listeners that don't know what that is, it's the only Australian university which offers courses, as far as I'm aware, in Asian and Pacific studies. I know that you can learn Tok Pisin language, for example, which is the language spoken in Papua New Guinea, as part of that degree or a resultant master's degree at ANU, for example. But overall, it still absolutely pales in comparison to the effort that Australia puts into understanding Asia and Southeast Asia.
So you mentioned earlier that you thought the Pacific region was of great importance to Australia. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, right. Well, I actually don't tend to look at the Asia Pacific region, as it's called, or the Indo-Pacific, or those two terms are quite interchangeable these days. I don't view it as this sort of two-dimensional regional block that features Asia and then separately features the Pacific. I tend to view the whole region holistically. So I view Asia Pacific as completely enmeshed with developments that occur in Fiji, for example, affects Indonesia just as much as the other way around. Australia's geopolitical, Australia geopolitically obviously means that we are encapsulated in all developments on all sides. Basically, where we're situated in the region means that things that happen either in the South Pacific or in Southeast Asia inevitably affect Australia just because of geography. Right. So if we take stability, for example, which I know is sometimes used as a bit of a political cliche, but instability, specifically in the South Pacific, definitely affects governance in Southeast Asia.
So moving a bit beyond the cliche, what are some specific examples which might illustrate that?
Right. Well, from an Australian standpoint, I think if we look at instability in the Solomon Islands, specifically, that led to the establishment of RAMSI, the Regional Assistant Mission to the Solomon Islands. That saw Australian defence personnel deployed there for 14 years amongst a situation of armed unrest. From a more regional point of view, I'd say there are plenty of examples. There was a referendum only last year where the small island state of Bougainville, just to the north of the Solomon Islands, voted for complete independence from Papua New Guinea, with over 97% of Bougainvilleans voting to leave, which is a huge number. So unfortunately, that doesn't mean that much is actually guaranteed. So there was a great article from Ben Bohane from the Lowy Institute, who he acknowledged the long journey ahead and the hard work that still has to take place before the Papua New Guinea government ratifies the decision and Bougainville gets any semblance of independence. But with a vote that high of over 97%, if Papua New Guinea refuses to give Bougainville independence, or if the situation drags on for too long, there very well may be civil unrest, which, as we have seen in Bougainville before, it happened in 1994, has the potential to erupt into very hot armed conflict. So this is going to create an international situation if the worst comes to worst, and that happens in Bougainville. It will affect Indonesia, which shares a border with Papua New Guinea. That's how it will affect Indonesia. So that's in an area that's already pretty tumultuous when one considers West Papua. And also the whole situation, the Bougainville situation, it affects the Solomon Islands, which is a country that the people in Bougainville feel ethnically closer to than Papua New Guinea, despite the fact that Bougainville has previously been administered by Papua New Guinea. And that was one of the reasons for the referendum to go ahead in the first place. And to believe that Australia would not be affected if something like this did break out is just simply naive. Likely, again, the ADF would have to get dragged in as a result should the situation escalate enough. So we can see here that one situation in small little Bougainville has affected not only Bougainville, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Australia.
But it hasn't affected them yet at this point, to my understanding. It seems like you're making a few assumptions about things which might happen in the future and haven't quite actually happened yet.
Well, I would argue that it actually has. If you go back and cast your mind back and remember that I actually mentioned the situation in 1994. So it also happened in the Solomon Islands in 2003, which led up to RAMSI, right? So I'm making this example, the Solomon Islands, for two reasons. One is to show how interconnected the region really is. And the other is to point out that Australia has thus far failed to properly understand situations and developments in the Pacific Islands, which contribute to them happening again and again. It happens in 1994, 10 years later in 2003. I believe that a lag in our education system, particularly in universities, contributes to that failed understanding.
Well, if we move on to a bit of a different track at the moment, in 2016, the Liberal coalition first announced its Step Up in the Pacific. This was followed with the creation of the ministerial portfolio, which was filled by Alex Hawke just recently in 2019, of the international development and the Pacific. Do you not think that these developments help address the shortfalls that you're describing and point towards, a more developed political interest in the Pacific from Australia?
Yeah, I do believe that they are very good starting points, absolutely. However, I do have no reason to believe that they are sort of reminiscent of a more prolonged political strategy of engagement. The reason I say this is because Australia has previously shown sporadic interest in the Pacific Islands. Unfortunately, this interest only comes when security developments, specifically in the South Pacific, take a turn for the worse. For example, in Fiji, the George Speight coup, or once again, I'll point to the Solomon Islands and Bougainville. These are all events where we witnessed an unfavourable security development occurring in the South Pacific, and then Australia gets involved. So I think what we're witnessing right now is just another part of that circular pattern, which sees political developments in the Pacific, which are unfavourable to Australia, forcing Australia's hand to step up in the way that was outlined in 2016. Step up its interests in the affairs of the island states. So when things go Australia's way, for example, Australian hegemony in the region is unchallenged, we tend to view the islands, in my view, with complete and utter indifference. When things do not go Australia's way, then we tend to need to step up.
Right. So would I be correct in assuming that, as a sort of corollary implication of what you just said, Australia's regional hegemony is currently being challenged?
Yes, I think it is, in sort of two specific ways. And I don't think it's just me who thinks so. Right? A lot of what I get is actually shaped from other academics that who look around the big issues of the day, which for Australia are the rise of China and climate change specifically. So these are, without a doubt, the two biggest shifts challenging Australia in our region. But first of all, I should clarify, actually, before I go any further, that I don't really like to use the word hegemon in relation to Australia's position in the region. I think that hegemon really infers an overarching control, and I don't think we have control over these islands at all, nor would I ever advocate that we really should be positioning ourselves for that. But I digress. Moving back onto climate change, it's really shown us a very salient example of how Australia does not have control. So what I would say about Australia's position in the region really is that there is a paradigm that Canberra specifically would like to continue to propagate, and that paradigm is sort of that we are some sort of regional big brother, right? But so as I was saying, right, let's just go back to climate change for a point. I'll make a specific point. So Michael O'Keefe actually wrote a very thoughtful piece in The Conversation last year, directly after the Pacific Island Forum in Tuvalu, which you might remember saw Scott Morrison at loggerheads with representatives from the Pacific Islands, specifically over Australia's climate commitments. I believe that O'Keefe used the words creative policy making regarding how Australia was going to keep opening coal mines at home while also maintaining amicable bilateral relationships with Pacific Island states that are the most affected by rising sea levels. So this is caused obviously by climate change. This is one area I don't think that Australia can necessarily throw its economic weight around. I know that we've been cutting aid in every single budget since Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister, and we know that the biggest beneficiaries also from our foreign aid are the Pacific Island states. So essentially, I don't think Tuvalu wants our money anymore. What they want is to help us keeping their homes from sinking. So I would agree with Michael O'Keefe saying that creativity is certainly going to be needed.
Right. Jumping back a bit to the first of the two reasons, You mentioned that the rise of China would also pose a challenge.
Yeah, for Australia, absolutely, it absolutely does. Specifically in relation to the Big Brother paradigm that I mentioned before, China specifically challenges that. It gives the Pacific states an additional option to turn to. If Pacific Islands don't necessarily think that Australia is helping, maybe they'll turn to another great power who does. Right? There also there are also more hardline reasons which outline the risk posed by China in the region. So, for example, there is a proposed military base in the Solomon Islands. Now, granted, I don't actually believe that having a base in the region adds anything in the way of strategic capability, right? If war broke out, a base that far from the Chinese mainland would be very, very hard to defend. However, it does serve other purposes. And I'll quote Hugh White here, who said that establishing a base in Australia's neighbourhood would be a low-cost, low-risk way to show off its growing military and diplomatic reach and clout. So having a base certainly serves Chinese political purposes. But the overarching pattern here, the point that I'm trying to make is that the Australian step up since 2016 is in fact reactive, as have up to this point all other Australian periods of interest in the Pacific. I think that this is problematic. I think that it's disingenuous policy making is the way I like to put it. And to presume really that the Pacific states can't see that it is insensitive is in fact insensitive. Somehow, like Canberra somehow believes that the Pacific Island states' diplomatic ability is somewhat lesser than ours. I mean, if we look back to realist theory, it teaches us that states will always look out for themselves and that Pacific Islands are no different, right? If they see Australia acting in a way that is against their interests, I think they will do something about it. And well, that is not in Australia's interest. So as young aspiring policymakers that you and I both are, Mitchell, as well as everyone relating to IAPSS in Oceania region, I think that it behoves us to not only diagnose problems, but also to propose solutions. And my solution to this problem of disingenuous policy making and of not necessarily an amicable or consistent step up is to really start to educate people in Australia about this region. I think that we need to send Australian students to the Pacific on either new Colombo scholarships or creating a new scholarship specifically for that purpose. I think we also need to try and branch out Australian soft power out into the Pacific Island states. Right. I recently read a good book from David Walker called Stranded Nation, in which he details how hard it has been for Australia to amicably engage in Asia, in Southeast Asia and in broader Asia. Walker literally outlines that we've been trying for years, literally since Federation. I don't understand why we think that the Pacific states would require any less prolonged effort to understand. I think that if we do that, if we truly try to engage from a position of understanding rather than some sort of quasi-hegemony, if you will, then when future problems arise, I think that we will find it much easier to diffuse these situations. And then as a result, we will have a more stable region in which to conduct foreign policy.
So if I can go into a bit more focus on something you mentioned earlier, Australia's role as a big brother, as opposed to having overarching control, and striking that balance between maintaining influence in the region and avoiding a neo-colonialist position, which can be difficult, particularly for Western countries. Do you think that it is possible to step up in a meaningful way without also risking damage to our regional reputation long term?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question and a very, very important part of this conversation that needs to be had. Neo-colonial intent, whether that is Australia's actual intent or not, needs to be accounted for. And clearly we need to do everything that we can to ensure that our step up, if that's what you want to continue to call it, is not perceived as being neo-colonial. I think that if it is, no amount of amicable diplomacy is going to save us. Like, once again, I think that this is where education can come into its own, really take the front line of this. If we educate youth who are interested in this field, interested in international relations, young Australians who are interested in the Pacific Islands, if we educate them about the needs of the Pacific Islands, as set from the island's point of view, rather than from our point of view, then that means that we can start, hopefully, to craft policy that caters to their needs, right? If we do cater to their needs, then I think that they are far more likely to think of us as the big brother or the protector, or however you want to think of it. That basically, I think that is far more likely to feed into the Australian paradigm that that Canberra wants to be propagated. So let me try and be a little bit more salient. I feel like I just said a lot of words. If we take Fiji, for example, they are worried, as are all Pacific states, about rising sea levels. So should Australia adjust on its climate policies, and then like whatever that new policy looks like, whatever the new climate policy looks like, if we then advertise that to Fiji, likely Fiji feels like Australia is acting in the region's interest, and therefore they have no need to try and bring in another large state like China, who claims that they will act in Fiji's interest. So as a result, Australia builds goodwill with Fiji and also helps keep China, from establishing permanent diplomatic routes in the South Pacific. So I think that's just one example which is pretty pertinent right now. I argue also for a more sustained effort in amicable diplomacy with the broader Pacific Islands. I think that amicable diplomacy will put Australia in a very good position in the future. As well, none of us really have a crystal ball, right? So all we can do right now is presume that something in the future will happen. There will be some sort of conflict situation in the future, and that Australia will have to work with the Pacific Islands in order to combat whatever that conflict situation is. So in order to your question, right, I think that we need to view influence differently. Right? I think that we can garner influence in the South Pacific by actually working in their interests rather than just doing it from ours. This requires us to sort of understand their problems, right, rather than just how we can influence them. It requires education and more sustained effort. I think that these things will eventually build goodwill, and then from that goodwill will come influence, right? So it's like an enmeshment of sort of realist and liberalist theory that could eventually pay dividends in the future.
But if our influence is built upon what we can do for their own interests, isn't it also possible that they might decide to take advantage of that? What would stop, say, Fiji from just threatening to go elsewhere for support if Australia denied them any one thing that they were hoping to accomplish?
Right. Well, I guess essentially there would be nothing stopping them from doing that. That's good statecraft, right? That's sort of how you, especially as a small power like Fiji, plays off state actors in order to increase its own standing in the world, right? So I think overall, I'm actually advocating more for a balancing act rather than a complete advocacy for either realist foreign policy or liberalist foreign policy. So I'm not suggesting that Australia needs to become some sort of a meek state in its attempt to get everyone to like it, to get the South Pacific states to just really like it. I am suggesting that we just need to have a more nuanced understanding of the region in which we live, and that having that understanding, which can be effectively garnered, in my belief, mostly effective through education, I think that overall is in Australia's interest.
And the need not to let Australia come across as meek. Do you reckon that the policy of Australia should change depending on the size of the nation that it's currently trying to influence? Say, for example, a country like New Zealand. Obviously, there's a lot of cultural history there, but should our relations with a larger country be somewhat different from a smaller country, such as the Solomon Islands or Tuvalu?
Well, I don't essentially think that our policy should be different, especially if the bedrock of this policy effort is essentially to be education. The idea is that we're educating ourselves on the Pacific Island states, again, what is necessary, what they need. However, underlying that is also the fact that each and every state is in itself different, right? Bilateral relationships between Australia and Japan are quite different from Australian bilateral relationships with Cambodia, or a smaller nation that we don't trade with as much, like Thailand, right? Because there are different interests at play there. So inevitably, the policies would be different, but it still doesn't change the fact that we need to understand this region from a more amicable understanding, which is fueled by education in the future. Does that help answer?
It does. It seems as though, based on your sort of views as you've explained them, that there isn't really a place for hard power influence between Australia and these Pacific Island states. Would you say that's the case?
Essentially, I guess, yes, there still needs to be. I'm not advocating that Australia withdraws any sort of military influence. We've seen, again, in the Solomon Islands and again in Fiji after the George Speight coup, there was Australian federal policemen helping to administer Fiji after that, for example. Australian defence forces in our region can do a lot of good, specifically in again, if we go back to the Bougainville situation that I spoke about, if that does manage to, or if that does unfortunately escalate into an armed situation, likely the ADF, Australian Defence Force, will be the primary peacekeepers in that situation, or at least that's how I see it unfolding. So there is definitely still a place for hard power politics, if that's what you want to call it, in this region. Again, I think that we need to just have a nuanced understanding of how all these factors into play. We have that nuanced understanding almost everywhere in every other region of the world. We understand how Australia fits into Asia, or we understand our relationship with the United States, but we don't really understand anything from the Pacific Island states' point of view.
All right, then. Well, I still just want to unpack one more thing. You started off this discussion by mentioning that you viewed the region as being holistic.
Yes.
But the challenges that you've outlined do seem to be Australian. How do occurrences in the Solomon Islands, for instance, affect what would happen in, say, the Philippines?
Right. Well, the first obvious answer to that would be climate change. Right. So the region, that whole Indo-Pacific region, is saturated with archipelagos, low-lying islands. Philippines and the Solomon Islands will both be equally affected, and both have a very real interest in stopping water levels from rising. Concurrent to that, there is also fishing, which is a huge source of income for all island states. So I admit that I'm not a climate scientist by any means, but I do know that acidification of salt water affects fishing adversely. It's bad for fishing, which will inherently affect the economy of all island states, both in the South Pacific, also in Southeast Asia. So the other challenge that I've been speaking about really is the rise of China. Right? So the laws of the sea, we know, are constantly studied by students of international relations or international law, typically surrounding Chinese activities in the South China Sea. Now, there's no reason at all, I don't think, to believe that Chinese actions in the South China Sea will not be emulated in the South Pacific, should they gain a diplomatic foothold in that region. So when you consider especially Chinese propensity to dismiss international tribunal rulings, when you look at in relation to the 2016 ruling, which was in the Philippines' favour, we also see there's increasing pushbacks by other Southeast Asian states against the rise of China. Right? We know that Indonesia is really pushing back very hard in what is called the North Natuna Sea, which is where the South China Sea and Indonesian seas, their exclusive economic zones, overlap. So, and pretty much every other state in Southeast Asia has some sort of a conflict with China regarding maritime boundaries. Right? So it's in everyone's own interests to ensure that an assertive, increasingly coercive China is checked. The whole region, from the Solomon Islands through to the Philippines, does not want to set a new set of international principles and norms surrounding maritime activity. So I think this is another reason where the islands, the whole Indo-Pacific, are really, truly interconnected. Fiji does not need to rely on China as much if, for example, they start trading more with Vietnam. And then in order for that to happen, we need to ensure that Chinese claims of expansion, the Chinese expansion in the sea, are not unchecked. If China expands itself into the whole region and claims more and more and more of the seas, as it still is doing, that will then affect trading routes between Fiji and Vietnam, for example. So once again, climate change and the rise of China are really big challenges to a complete interconnected region.
So the example given between Vietnam and, was it Thailand? Do you believe then that trade would help counteract Chinese expansion within the area and diversifying that trade?
Yes, I think diversifying trade is very important, and it's actually at this point pretty original and a bit of a cliche. And I know that we agreed to avoid cliches, but diversifying trade is healthy from every single state, every populace on the country. I think that is just a truism, and it needs to happen. COVID-19 especially, it's really saliently pointed out how the reliance on any one trade partner is unhealthy, especially to the tune of over 30% of overall trade, like we see here in Australia. We trade over 30% of our overall two-way trade is with China. So I just think that overall it's good international policy to not rely too much on any one partner. And I think that Australia could play a really big role there, not just ensuring our own trade diversification, but also in linking Oceania and Southeast Asia. Right? What do I mean by this? I mean that Australia we're a member of the Pacific Island Forum, and I know that we're also an observing member of ASEAN. So we are very well placed to link this region. A large foreign policy initiative that I would like to see is some sort of joint dialogue initiative between the two regional blocs that are the Pacific Island Forum and ASEAN. I think that it would be a really good way to foster relationships between, for example, once again, the Solomon Islands and Vietnam, or Fiji and Indonesia. It would be a really good way to foster relationships between those countries, which would also help to combat common security problems, namely climate change and China, as we have discussed. So this joint dialogue initiative, right, I think that that's actually something that I would really like to foster at a local and youth level. So I think that's maybe something that IAPSS can look at doing in the future. We can establish some sort of a joint initiative between Oceania and Asian regional branches, perhaps. I mean, of course, because of COVID-19, that will have to wait until we're all allowed to meet again. But yeah, that's maybe watch this space.
Yes, absolutely, and hopefully it's not too much longer before we can leave our houses again.
Yeah.
But I believe that will take us to the end of our interview. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Thank you very much for meeting with us and being our guest on this first ever episode of the IAPSS Oceania podcast.
No worries, Mitch. Thank you very much for having me.
And just a reminder to all of our listeners that this is going to be an ongoing podcast, so make sure you keep an eye out for the next episode.